Chris's final question is, what was Daniel doing that was okay? He was embroiled with the magicians and astrologers, etc. What were the magi who came to honor Christ doing that was okay? Is it less about what they were doing, but rather who's on the other end and why they're doing what they're doing?
Yeah, I think that observation in Chris's question is correct. And this actually goes, I'll try to summarize it again, but it gets into a paper I wrote on the Old Testament response to pagan divination. And again, I've given you that. You can post it with the episode. To cut to the chase here, the paper is about the fact that in Deuteronomy, you have this list of forbidden practices, things that you're not supposed to do, like communicating with the dead or whatever, that are abominable. But there are a couple of things in that list that Old Testament prophets elsewhere do, and they're not punished for it. They're doing their job. And so the question arises, well, how do they get away with that? Well, the short answer to that is they get away with it because they are soliciting information from the right source for the right reasons. Namely, they were chosen as a prophet of God, and God contacts them, and they have these conversations, and they see things, they have visions, whatever. I mean, it is about the source, and it is about the intent, in this case, obedience to the true God. So the true God is really the orienting point for both things. He is the source, and he is the reason why you do this. You do it because you're obeying what he tells you to do, and the means by which to communicate with him that he assigns to you, that he tells you to use or to do. So again, people look at the Deuteronomy passage and they think it's sort of categorical, when it actually isn't. There's a context to it. And the overarching context to this thing generally is a true prophet of God, someone who is getting divine information from the other side, from the correct source, is one, to quote Jeremiah 23:16, is one who has stood in the council. The true test of a prophet is, have you encountered God in his throne room, in his council, to receive your commission to do what you're doing? And we call that broadly, have you had a divine encounter? Have you been commissioned by the true God? If you have, and God says, hey, you can use the Urim and the Thummim, you can do this, or I'm going to communicate with you in a dream, or I'm going to give you the ability to interpret a dream, or I'm going to give you the ability, okay, in the context here, to discern something I'm doing, some messaging that I'm giving in the heavens. Okay, that's okay because it's the correct source. And, I'm in control of the dispensing of this information. One of the reasons why a lot of this stuff was violated, like communicating with the dead, which the biblical prophets do not do. I mean, you don't have, there's a little twist on this in 1 Samuel 28 when Samuel is called up by the medium at Endor, that God permits Samuel to have that conversation with Saul. But other than that, you don't have biblical prophets engaging in this kind of thing. In that case, they are the dead guy. But the reason why a number of these things were forbidden is that you can't have humans initiate this sort of contact with the other side because they don't know what they're getting, and they can be misled or destroyed by the information. And so God sets up rules for his people, do's and don'ts. Do not do this thing, not because it's a fairy tale and not because it doesn't work. The rules are there because it does work, and it's dangerous. God gave the Israelites the Urim and the Thummim and the ephod and all these sorts of things, and he gave them prophets, people that stood in the council and were sent to the people. God gave them a variety of means by which they could learn information from him. It was initiated by God, the information is controlled by God, and the information is true and correct because he's God. He's the true God. If you don't have those boundaries and those parameters, okay, it is dangerous. You should not be doing this. You will be misled. I have enemies, God says. Okay, there are other gods around here. Again, back to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. You are surrounded by hostile entities, not just hostile people, but hostile entities. And wouldn't they love to get your ear? I mean, there's this sense of protection. These rules are here for your own good. Now, Daniel is trained, again, in all the, the wisdom of the wise men. And if people do a study of the term wise men, you actually read through Daniel, in Daniel 2, where it says, just go to Daniel 2 here in verse 2. The king Nebuchadnezzar commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dream. Of course, they can't do it. Chaldeans answer in verse 10, hey, there's no man on earth that can do this stuff. No great and powerful king has ever asked such a thing of any magician, an enchanter, and Chaldean. Well, then the king gets torqued, and he commands that, quote, all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree goes out, the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions. So Daniel and his companions are part of this group. And in fact, Daniel is actually credited, and his companions they're credited with being the best among the wise men. They're the most skilled, at doing what the wise men did. And we're not told, in painful detail specifically what these things were, but you say, well, why is this okay for Daniel? Because the biblical story about Daniel is really clear. Daniel understands that the only God that really has this information, that he's actually going to ask for information, is the God of Israel. So it doesn't really matter what the means or the technique or the little ritual or whatever is. Daniel is not going to direct it to an inferior, inept, hostile God. He's going to direct what he's doing to the God of Israel. I mean, and they put their lives on the line. They won't eat the king's food. I mean, they're serious about it. They're not going to say, well, I'm not going to eat that, and then turn around the next day and say, hey, where's Bel? I can't wait to pray to Bel or do this ritual for Bel, to get information. They're not doing that. Okay, they have their theology correct. And so we need to see Daniel's status and his training in the context of his loyalty to the true God, which is borne out in the rest of the story. Now, as far as astral stuff, let me just make the comment, since we've gotten into it in this question and, in an earlier question. And in fact, this was part of my subject matter in the interview I just did for Gaiam TV, biblical astral prophecy. Why are there zodiac mosaics in synagogues dated to late antiquity in Jerusalem and in Haifa and some of these places? I mean, why do we have zodiac mosaics in a synagogue at all? Well, it's because of a very simple thing. And it goes back again to passages like Ezekiel 1, which the four faces of the cherubim are the cardinal points of the Babylonian zodiac. That's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. It's deliberate. It's theological messaging, because back in Ezekiel 1, it's not Marduk that's sitting on the throne governing the 4 points of the zodiac, governing the times and the seasons and the fate of men and women and children. It's not Marduk that's doing any of this. It's Yahweh, the God of Israel, who's actually in control. And that's Ezekiel's message. Hey, we're sitting here in Babylon by the river Kivar, and things are going really bad, and it looks really bad, and we're still licking our wounds, and we know that we were jerks, and that's why we're here, and God hated that, and God sent us in exile. But guess what? Marduk didn't beat Yahweh. Yahweh is still on the throne. And Ezekiel uses Babylonian imagery to make the point. What people we're sitting here in Babylon, people think that this God is great, Marduk is great, and look what he did to the Israelites, and he's in control of everything now. Pardon me. Okay, he's not. So the message to the captives is, God is the one who controls the times and the seasons and the course of history and the events that happen here. He is the one in control. Now, since Israelites, biblical writers, and people who are believers, believe that. They believe that, hey, doesn't Genesis say God created all this stuff for times and seasons and all this stuff? Well, of course it does. So the common belief was, and it was good theology, that, look, that stuff going on up there, again, they're not astronomers, they don't have modern science, they're not doing, theoretical physics and all this kind of stuff, but they're looking at the heavens with the notion that, we know who really made those. And I'm betting that if we really understood how those things moved and what they did, that God could communicate certain thoughts to us about what he intends to do and what he is doing. We have Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. Okay, the firmament proclaims his handiwork. It's not just saying, "Oh, that's a nice artistic picture," because if you look at what the rest of the Psalm says in Psalm 19, again, it's not that, "Oh, those are neat decorations." Day to day pours out speech. Night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech. Nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice, whose voice? Who's the there? It's the heavens. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Now, the Masoretic text actually reads, their line goes out through all the earth. It's a reference to the ecliptic. The ecliptic is the imaginary line that the constellations of the zodiac travel. Again, there was this sense, even in the Bible, that you could look at the heavens and possibly, again, if you were asking the true God for the information or learn what you're doing here, or depending on him, you're assigning, the knowledge to where it needs to be assigned, and your loyalty to the true God is not in question. It's possible that you could learn something up there. Again, that was the belief. Paul quotes Psalm 19, the passage I just read. He quotes verse 4 in Romans 10, verse 18. Anybody remember what Romans 10 is talking about? That's the passage where Paul says, hey, what about hearing about Jesus? How shall they hear unless they have a preacher? And faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Have they not heard? And Paul says in verse 18, yes, they have heard. And then he quotes Psalm 19, verse 4. Their line or their voice goes throughout the whole earth, their words to the end of the world. It's an oblique reference to the idea that somehow the heavens communicated the coming of the King, the coming of Jesus. Now, I personally think that what Paul was thinking about there, and I can't prove it. I'm going to be upfront and say I can't prove that Paul was thinking about this, but I have a suspicion that what Paul was thinking there is what we read in Revelation 12, the astral signage of the birth of the Messiah. Again, I can't prove it. It's my suspicion. He's thinking something because he quotes the verse. And Paul's a good guy. He's a faithful believer. He's not like a heretic. He's not like, iffy. It's Paul. He wrote half the New Testament. So there is this sense, again, that, if God chooses to communicate to people by this means, he very well can do it. There is something to be learned there. And that's why you had this, again, assumption among people who were serious about their theology, that something can be learned here. Now, where they drew the line, and the early church drew the same line here, where they drew the line was this notion, just like we saw Paul condemn this idea in Galatians 4, this notion that these celestial objects are themselves deities with any power and that they control human fate. That is bunk. Only God controls human fate. These objects do not. So serious believers would have been offended by what we think of as modern astrology. That was bad theology. We'll let Oprah do that, okay, or somebody else. That is not what we're talking about here. It's not what Paul's thinking in Romans 10. It's not what John was thinking when he wrote Revelation 12. It's not what Daniel's thinking. Only God controls the flow of history and the fate of humanity. Okay, he might message something through these objects, but they themselves have no power over you. And that's why Paul says, you're crazy to go back to this now that you've been liberated by Christ. But anyway, I know that was a long, sort of convoluted answer to that, but you get into all sorts of areas about that. I don't think what Daniel's doing is wrong. It's very evident whose side Daniel is on. And it's very evident that God does give him information. He's the one behind Daniel's effectiveness. And there is no question about Daniel's loyalty.